I title my humble contribution, A Persisting Injustice in America's Economy. Although much attention in America and many other countries, I think, is devoted, and rightly so, to economic gaps between demographic groups, resulting in part from discrimination. One of the most striking gaps is that between the incomes of low-wage earners and the incomes of high earners. It is somewhat hard for me to understand that this could go on decade after decade. As is widely understood, income is now redistributed from people earning high incomes to people with low incomes by means of additional tax hikes on incomes in the high income tax brackets with which to pay for tax cuts on incomes in the low income brackets. Yet, present day redistribution falls short of what could be done. In the US, a series of tax laws enacting tax credits on earned income, known as the EITC, starting with the Tax Reduction Act of 1975 and later the Tax Reform Act of 1986, have been instituted to ease the difficulties faced by single mothers and married families with children. In 1993, though, the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1993, OBRA 1993, created a new tax credit, new credit formula called the childless EITC for low-income workers with no qualifying children that they can point to. Note that so far as I can determine from the legislative history of the Congressional Research Service, from which I've just quoted, the men eligible for the tax cut are not required to be married either. So there's a sophisticated step there in the right direction, but not far enough, as I will argue. We here in American society can take some pride in the redistributive measures legislated by the government to raise the wages net of tax among low-wage earners, especially from 1993, at least to the arrival of COVID-19. My economics doesn't go beyond COVID-19. This set of advances in the redistribution of wage income has gone farther than I had realized when writing my book, Rewarding Work, around 1996 or so. That was a striking development in social thought. As I said before, I'm ignorant about what's going on in this dimension let's say in the Western European economies. Maybe some of you can inform us on that later. This development may have arisen first in the thinking of Wilbur Mills, the politician who grew up in Arkansas and studied at Harvard Law School, was elected to the House of Representatives in 1938, and he became chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and was the architect of the Tax Reform Act of 1969. Yet a great many of us view the degree of redistribution achieved by American legislation as far from adequate. This thinking of redistributing, this bold idea, brings to mind the philosopher John Rawls, who grew up in Maryland, studied in Princeton, and was soon appointed professor of philosophy at Harvard, where he taught for some 40 years. He hit upon the concept of economic justice in his book, A Theory of Justice, published in 1971, around 2 years apart from the breakthrough constructed by Wilbur Mills, though they may well have embarked on building their constructions, their conceptual constructions, in about the same year. Rawls declared that the just distribution of wages is the distribution that workers would agree as the most fair if they didn't know what position he or he would occupy in the economy. Wilbur Mills, in wanting to raise the level of after-tax incomes earned by low earners and pay for that by lowering the after-tax income left for the relatively high earners, was taking a step in the same direction that Rawls was to do, namely increase tax rates on the more advantaged workers in order to be able to afford to decrease the tax rates on the less advantaged. The common thread running through the visions of both Rawls and Mills, I think, is that the increase of rewards to those earning the least is to come through the decrease of the rewards of those earning the most, or the near most. The main difference between Rawls and Mills is that Rawls argues for a redistribution of total tax revenue to the full amount that he understands economic justice requires, while Mills sought or settled for a modest redistribution of after-tax incomes. The distribution formulated in the 1970s by Wilbur Mill, finally legislated in the 1980s during the Reagan administration, sought to get men off the streets and out of criminal activity at a time when the streets of New York had become dangerous, and also to help women with raising children. Now, some 50 years after the ingenious Mill and the profound Rawls raised hopes, perhaps even expectations, we can ask what the net improvement has been since the late 1960s, when better rewards began to be expected. Data from the Census Bureau show that in 1967, just before hopes arose that rewards to the disadvantaged would soon be increased, the annual wage earnings in real terms of workers in the fourth quintile was 6.19 times higher than the real earnings of the people in the lowest quintile. Why the fourth quintile? Well, it's just a quirk. I didn't want to get into the fifth quintile. It might be thought that with all the social progress, the situation has improved a lot since that time. By 2018, though, the annual real wage earnings in the fourth highest quintile had risen to 7.27 times higher than the annual real wage earnings in the lowest quintile. Evidently, the wages in the fourth quintile pulled much farther above the real wage incomes in the lowest quintile between 1969 and 2018. I was struck to see that real earnings of people in the bottom quintile went from $12,000 a year in real terms to $16,199, while real earnings of the fourth quintile went from $76,000 to $117,000. It's as if the low quintile people had not seen any, or at least much, growth at all, though their percentage increase was not very far less than the percentage increase of the fourth quintile people. Thus, we can imagine more vividly, I think, when we look at these stark numbers, the relatively poor conditions in which the bottom echelons of the labor force must live and work. With these economic prospects among the disadvantaged having developed over many decades, it seems clear why a sizable number of the disadvantaged have opted for criminal activities and other activities. Now, there have been some opponents to extending those efforts. Why not address this problem by fully implementing Rawls's proposal? Subsidize low-wage workers' supply of labor, or employers' demand for low-skilled workers, or both, it doesn't much matter, so as to pull up the low-end wages and low-wage employment too, thus lifting living standards at the low end of the labor and introducing them to the many many self-satisfactions. Forget that sentence. We'll go back and look at it someday. Unfortunately, the Rawls-Mills approach has been met with calls for a radical departure. The Belgian political philosopher Philippe van Perijs had already reduced support for work, relatively low-wage work included, by arguing that what would be most desirable was a universal basic income, or UBI. And this proposal was later repeated by the former Californian businessman Andrew Yang, now living, I believe, in New York's Hudson Valley. When a questioner brought up the UBI following my talk in 2019 at a conference in Estoril, as you know, that's in Portugal, I expressed horror at the idea of that idea. And I immediately sent a piece to Project Syndicate, which I'd like to quote. We must oppose the universal basic income, not only because it is a lamentable use of public revenue that would be better directed toward pulling up the wages of low-end workers to a level enabling their self-support, which is essential for people's self-esteem, either through earned income tax credits or through subsidies to companies for their employment of low-wage workers, thus pulling up workers' pay. but also because it is apt to draw or keep many people and also children away from work, which is, for most people at any rate, the only available avenue for personal fulfillment and indeed to people's involvement in the world. Well, I was outraged in writing that paragraph because the centrality of work in the good life has been a theme of mine. I discovered once I subjected Margaret to my complaints. It's been a subject of mine from my 1972 book, Inflation Policy, and the centrality of work and it has central to the good life has been a theme of mine from my 1972 book, Inflation Policy and Unemployment Theory, which brought up the feelings of self-respect, the esteem in community, the sense of economic independence, and job satisfactions of doing a piece of work and doing it well. From that 1972 book, I kept working from time to time in that area up to the 1997 book, Rewarding Work, and even in some pages of my 2013 book, Mass Flourishing. What then? What to do? Why not undertake additional governmental measures to raise self-support with its manifold rewards, both to low-wage workers and to the rest of society? There appears to be a significant interest in a further initiative in the Mills-Rawls direction. Yet a congressman on the Republican side of the aisle has recently said, I couldn't find his name again, recently said that any such governmental initiative to address the nation's poverty would appreciably slow growth, referring, I think, if anything, to the growth rate of productivity. I object to that too. It might be seen as plausible that a further shift of after-tax incomes from the well-off in the labor force to the very poor would have the side effects of causing an increase, a net increase of aggregate demand, and thus a fall of national saving. A dissenter might argue that the poor would raise their savings as much as the rich would cut their savings, but never mind. As a result, the public debt would be pushed up toward a higher path. As a consequence, saving and investment would be contracted. Growth would be slow, barring other actions in the short run. But after the capital, so we'll give them a little concession there, but after the capital stock has slowed on its way to a lower of the growth paths that the economy could have taken, the growth rate would regain its previous speed, its previous force, which depends on the creativity and zeal of the population, not the current level of the capital stock or some measure of wealth. The growth that the congressman worries over will not be permanently slowed. So that is not so the objection by this congressman, well, it's nice to see he cares about growth, but it's not persuasive. Yeah, of course, debt-financed income tax cuts for the poor would bring a rising public debt more trouble. That could become serious if the public debt grew while the economy did not grow. We will have to worry about ever mounting public debt if our economy is not going to have to grow at a good rate. If it's not going to grow at a good rate. One of the worrisome assumptions in the central governments of the West is the widely held belief that the decent growth after 1972 will be regained. Perhaps even the rapid, super rapid growth of the 50s and 60s. That's a worrisome assumption because I don't think there's any basis for belief that we're going to go back to the fast growth period. I don't see it. At this conference, I don't detect much of an expectation of rapid growth around the corner. So I wouldn't want to close this, close out here. I wouldn't want to close without stating that America and the entire West need much more than inclusion, of course. Highly important though inclusion is. Some critical forces that once sparked the explosion of indigenous innovation, human values such as the desire for individual achievement and self-expression, have largely been lost, it seems to me. Our economies appear to operate now on a mix of capitalist power and corporatist power in the sense of governmental manipulation of the companies. I believe that the West will pay a high price if it does not meet the need to regain the spirit of imagination, of exploration, and self-expression that, for a century or more, inspired widespread indigenous innovating and thus brought about the phenomenon of mass flourishing. Thank you.
Hello, Professor. My name is Alfredo Navarrete, and I want to ask you two questions. The first one is if there is a relationship between wages and productivity, and if so, wouldn't it be better to provide workers, low-wage workers, with skills to improve their productivity?
I'm sorry, that's a question?
Yes.
What is the question?
The question is if there is a relationship between productivity and wages, and if so, wouldn't it be better to provide low-wage workers with skills to improve their productivity?
Oh, wouldn't it be better to provide them with productivity?
With skills.
Skills.
To be productive.
Ah. Got it. Well, I'm sure there's some merit in that, but it would worry a little. One is that I don't think we can dependably turn the crank and increase somebody's skills. Not all people are able to absorb new skills. There are a lot of people out there who are doing very menial things. That's not because they like menial, boring, uneventful work. It's because they're not able they're not qualified to have better jobs. And of course, I think that the government should be taking actions to help workers to move into more interesting jobs, more interesting work. Wilbur Mills and John Rawls were simplifying by couching everything in terms of money and income and wealth. And you're right, of course, that they're also that it would be nice if we could increase skills. That might not be as cost efficient as just using money. Something very direct about money, and we have, in the United States, we do have a school system that provides kids in junior high school and high school with many kinds of skills. It's true that some young people will leave school before they have acquired any skills to speak of. And but maybe many of those people are simply not able to, do not have the natural abilities to be able to acquire more skills. Otherwise,
But I think,
yeah.
oh, sorry. Can we move on? Just one more question, I think.
Thank you, Ned. And I'd like to kind of start with what I think is a Phelpsian, Rawlsian answer to the last question, which is that providing skills is good as long as those people who have the skills can get jobs, and giving people skills doesn't guarantee them employment. And from my perspective, and I think Ned was emphasizing that, and Rawls was tending in that direction toward the end of his life, I mentioned this in comments this morning, that we have a huge problem with involuntary unemployment. And Rawls didn't really address that problem specifically, but in 1997, when Ned's book, Rewarding Work, came out, I've been to the Harvard archives and have a copy on my computer of a letter from Rawls to Ned, congratulating him on the brilliant book, Rewarding Work, and hoping that he mentions in the letter that he hoped that Daniel Moynihan, after whom the train station I came in today into, he thought, well, do you think Moynihan might push something like this? And Moynihan never did. And so I think that's part of the problem with justice here is we need to focus on unemployment and involuntary unemployment, and starting by recognizing that the unemployment statistics do not give a very good picture of unemployment, because there are a lot of people who don't show up in those statistics who would like to be working and aren't. And I'd also like to add that I also have found in the archives, a letter from Rawls to Philippe von Paris, who Ned mentioned in his talk.
I didn't know that.
I'll send it to you.
Bracing myself.
Well, it's a great letter. Von Paris proposed the basic income idea to Rawls, and I don't know if people know this. Rawls responded by citing that he didn't think that Malibu surfers would be able to...
I can comment on that. I knew Rawls pretty well since I was practically working next to him for 13 months or so. And after his book came out, not right away, but maybe within a decade, I think I was in the Netherlands in the summer. I was making a little extra money with some, what was called teaching at the university there, but I don't think I had to teach anything. Anyway, I wrote John Rawls, and because I'd had a little time to think about his book, which came out 2 or 3 years later after our being together at CASBS. And I said, you know, Jack, you have not made explicit that you mean that that these subsidies are for people who are working. It's their active work that's being subsidized. It's not for you're not calling for just to quote Nixon, throwing money at the people, at the population. So a few days went by without reply from Rawls. A month went by. A year went by. Still no reply. Somebody told me that he had a huge stack of correspondence and he hadn't got it. Well, I guess after my book, Rewarding Work, he got my point that it's very important to make explicit that it's not only the income standards we want to raise, but we want to make it possible for them to work on so they have decent so one of the last pieces he ever wrote in his life was an essay in which he said that no, people who leave the economy and are subsisting, maybe with help from their parents, on the beaches of the Pacific Ocean, they're not going to get these subsidies, of course. So he finally made that explicit. But unfortunately, in a relatively obscure philosophical magazine, I think, I could look that up. But Rawls never intended did not intend to propose anything more than what he explicitly said, namely a subsidy that goes to employees of firms. And either the subsidies might be transmitted through the firms or directly to the employees, but they're very much connected with the income tax.